Hi, I'm David. I am one of the MCs for today's webinar. I am the founder of PRECURSOR. PRECURSOR is a purpose-built advisory firm for folk. Some people have called us the Avengers of Folk, and our superpower is that we have helped develop, finance, and build over $60 billion worth of landmark infrastructure, including FERVO, as well as Tesla. In the last year, we have helped our companies raise hundreds of millions of dollars of folk capital, build billion-dollar pipelines, as well as help secure billion-dollar offtakes. We are leaning even more into the offtake world and launching a dedicated PPA and offtake practice. We view significant PPAs, especially ones from hyperscalers, as the precursor, if not the prerequisite, for securing significant venture capital as well as project finance funding. Thank you guys for joining us. And we're so excited to do the first collab between PRECURSOR, Daylight, and Deep Carb Connect with Microsoft, FERVO, PG&E, and ARBOR. Today's conversation will be focusing on something very concrete and tactical. How do you win a clean, firm power PPA or offtake agreement from a hyperscaler? This is obviously important, but for those of you who do not live, breathe, climate tech, and energy transition, trillions of dollars are being invested into data center infrastructure. The world is electrifying. And for the startups in the audience, startups need hyperscaler offtakes. They are prerequisites in order to be bankable. And that means for many people, how do you raise your first significant VC round? How do you raise project finance? And how do you commercialize your technology? All this doesn't happen without a hyperscaler offtake. So in this session, we're going to dive into three pools of wisdom. We're going to first talk about why is clean, firm power important? 2, what do hyperscalers want in an offtake partner? 3, what is it like for a startup to negotiate PPA with a giant? That includes hyperscalers, utilities, and energy majors. We are so lucky for today's webinar to have an all-star cast that represents every side and every part of the clean, firm PPA ecosystem. We have hyperscalers and buyers. So we have the great Mike Alter from Microsoft. We have sellers/providers. That we have FERVO, which is perhaps the leader in securing advanced clean energy, firm energy PPAs. And we have my friend Paul Sabbagh, who's a senior director there. We also have ARBOR, whose CEO and founder, Brad, is probably one of the more active actors and popular actors in this new clean, firm power market. And last but not least, we have Joby Bernstein, strategist from PG&E, who can tell you that there is an 800-pound gorilla called utilities in the grid that is a major decision maker in this entire process. I think now we're going to jump into intros, and let's start off with Paul, and then we'll go to Mike, Joby, and Brad.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I appreciate that introduction. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with FERVO, so FERVO was founded in 2017 by our two co-founders, Tim Latimer and Jack Norbeck. Essentially what FERVO is at its core is a pure play IPP that's focused on developing enhanced geothermal systems. And so really, Tim and Jack coalesced on this idea back in 2017. Given the shale revolution and advancements in oil and gas technologies, the question was really posed as to why the advancements in the shale revolution were never applied to conventional geothermal. And when you looked at, conventional geothermal, historically speaking, or at least domestically speaking, it accounted for such a small portion of our total capacity on our grid today. And, Tim and Jack set out to, not only question that thesis, but, understand, given the load growth and demand for clean, firm power, why these advancements in technologies couldn't be applied to the geothermal space. And so, FERVO has been at it ever since 2017. It's been a lot of trial and error, but we're, in a very strong position right now. And as David alluded to, we've been extremely successful in securing and procuring offtake agreements with a lot of hyperscalers as well as utilities. And so glad to be on this panel and glad to have this discussion with all these colleagues.
Great. Mike, I'd love to have you hear about you.
Thanks, David. Nice to see everyone, meet everyone. My name is Mike Alter. I work as a carbon-free energy originator at Microsoft. And I think people are generally familiar with Microsoft, but in terms of the structure that I sit within, we have our cloud business that we have a broad energy group within. So on my side, I'm primarily looking at offtake options with different kinds of advanced energy technologies. And then we also have colleagues who are looking at working with the likes of Joby and other utilities to figure out how do we get energy supply agreements for all of our data centers. So there's definitely a Venn diagram with overlapping circles in that regard. Looking forward to discussion today.
Okay. Now, Paul. Oh, excuse me, Joby.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. My name is Joby. I'm a strategy expert at PG&E, where I work on our long-range strategy and our planning across California's energy transition. So this includes stuff like procuring clean energy, grid electrification, modernizing our outdated grid, and really preparing for new large loads like data centers and advanced manufacturing. If you're not familiar with PG&E, we're one of the largest utilities across the country. We serve about 16 million customers across 70,000 square miles in Northern California and Central California. This includes all of Silicon Valley. And we operate a grid with roughly 100,000 miles of lines and currently have a data center pipeline of 10 to 15 gigawatts, many of which are looking for clean, firm power. Just before PG&E, I spent time across the climate investing and policy landscape. I worked in the Department of Energy in the Loan Program Office, and I also ran for US Congress on a climate platform. And right now I currently chair the Democratic Party's climate platform in California. So I'm excited to be here because the challenge we're discussing today when it comes to scaling clean, firm 24/7 power is really one of our defining constraints at PG&E for decarbonization, electrification, and economic growth in California.
Great. Brad?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, David, for the intro, and Jack for helping organize this. And want to say hey to everyone that's able to join it. Very excited to have this opportunity to chat about 24/7 CFE. Really quick, I'm the founder and CEO of ARBOR Energy. And I started out my career as an aerospace engineer working at SpaceX developing rocket engines. Actually was working on becoming an astronaut myself for some time before I really kind of pivoted, catalyzed by doing disaster response and wildfire work in California, and felt that rather than trying to get off this planet, was going to do the best to pull together some of the brightest folks I know and work on developing technologies that could help us save it. And 24/7 carbon-free energy is one of the single biggest knobs in that kind of impact chain. And we're really excited to be leveraging a lot of the same technology that our team developed at SpaceX, applying that to delivering abundant, low-cost, clean, firm power here at ARBOR. Our approach is we're developing the next generation of modular turbines, which use supercritical CO2 and oxy-combustion for zero-emission power ranging from 25 megawatts, which is our Lego or sort of building block module. You can go all the way up to 2.5 gigawatts at a site. So we can use natural gas, we can use biomass, ultimately, we produce clean power with zero atmospheric emissions, no NOx, no SOx, no particulate matters, and of course, no greenhouse gas emissions. We've grown to a team of 45. And at the end of last year, we announced our $55 million Series A to complete development of our technology and map our ramp up in production. And we are very bullish on data center build out and AI and how that can transform society for the better. And we're very committed to our hyperscaler partners to decarbonize the power required to get us there.
Wonderful. And now my co-MC, co-host, Lisa.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's an honor to be around this table with everyone. I'm Lisa. I'm the founder and CEO at Daylight Infrastructure. We're building an AI technology and advisory platform focused on bridging the data gap between off-takers and project developers. So my background is in commercializing energy technologies as an early member of the commercial team at Antora Energy. And seeing firsthand how difficult it is to really secure offtakes and financing as an emerging technology provider, Daylight is focused on helping to bridge that information gap. And so with that, we're building out this diligence playbook and criteria checklist that hyperscalers and offtakers need to hear and see from project developers. And I think this is a perfect segue into our first question for the group, which is, we're here to talk about the importance of clean firm power. And I'm curious to hear from the group, how does this fit into the broader power procurement strategy? And perhaps we can start with Mike.
Thanks, Lisa. I would say at the highest level, I think there's a more important question to the grid more broadly about why clean firm power is important. And Joby can probably weigh in on this too from the utilities perspective, but resource adequacy is the name of the game today. And people are really focused on getting those megawatts onto the grid at the hours of the day and season where we need it the most. So I think from a grid planning perspective, that's why it's really critical. And then when I look more internally to Microsoft, I think there's probably two key principal benefits that we focus on. The first is related to the resource adequacy piece, and that's how do we leverage these technologies to unlock new data center capacity? So we might be looking to expand our footprint in regions that are power constrained or capacity constrained. And so these kinds of resources with more of a firm baseload type profile can provide significant capacity benefits in that regard. And then I'd say second, which is related to the first two, is we have really ambitious sustainability goals at Microsoft, principally being carbon negative by 2030. So clean firm power just means you're going to get that many more megawatt hours of clean generation around the clock to help us meet all those different goals. And then I'd say maybe looking externally again, but with very important implications, not just for Microsoft, but corporates more broadly, is around the ongoing revisions to the greenhouse gas protocol and the potential to require reporting on an hourly basis rather than an annual basis. And so if that happens, I think that would be just another catalyst in terms of driving a price premium or, a premium value, if you will, to these kinds of firm clean technologies.
Great. Yeah, that's really insightful, Mike. It's interesting to hear about resource adequacy to resilience and then the premium value that low carbon electricity can command. Joby, would love to hand over the mic to you and hear your take from the PG&E perspective.
Yeah, I think I'll add on to the great points that Mike made. From our perspective, clean firm power is becoming important for three main reasons. The first is reliability. A state like California is adding a ton of new wind and solar every year, which is great, but we also are seeing our need to electrify transportation and buildings and having a lot higher peak loads and higher load on the system. And the problem is that most clean energy doesn't show up if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And PG&E's job is to provide light on the darkest nights and heat on the coldest days. And so really, if you want a renewables grid that actually works, we need to have clean, firm power. The second piece of it is load growth. For the first time in a while, utilities are actually starting to see load growth This comes from EVs, from heat pumps, industrial electrification, and our favorite topic with data centers. We're basically, for the past 20 years, PG&E has seen flat or declining load growth. Right now, we are actually expected to double our load, which is something that most utilities are not prepared for. And this creates a real need for that 24/7 dispatchable clean electrons in order to keep pace with the growth in the grid without having to throw on new gas. And then third, especially important in California, affordability and resilience. If we're not going to build with clean firm, our alternatives are either overbuilding intermittent renewables and then also continuing to build more gas into the system, which generally California policies are prohibiting. So we really need clean firm to come in to reduce the total system costs and also improve resilience to ensure it's deployed in the right places.
Great. Thanks, Joby.
And Joby, do you want to talk a little bit about your PG's role in this entire ecosystem?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like we're not a tech developer, but we're really like this key market actor that can help scale this. So I think I always say there's three main roles that we can play. Our first is as a utility, we're the system planner and the integrator. We ensure that new resources can interconnect to the grid, they can operate reliably, and they can provide capacity value where it's needed. The second part is we serve as an offtake enabler. Either we do this directly through utility procurement for our own customers, and this is generally covered through regulatory frameworks, but also indirectly. Like we'll help make sure that if a company like Microsoft or another hyperscaler wants to connect to the grid, we can help kind of ensure that projects are financeable through contracts and credible integration pathways. And then lastly, I'm sure we'll touch on this more later, but just the transmission and interconnection piece. We can help move a great project idea and a great PPA to one that can actually deliver electrons to where it's needed most. And so we kind of jump in and serve those three roles, ensuring that the power is actually delivered to the customer.
Great. So now we're going to kind of move into the next step of our conversation. And I think this is maybe for a lot of the people in our audience, the most interesting question is like, what is a hyperscaler looking for in an offtake partner? And I'd love for Mike to kind of share his thoughts.
Awesome. Yes, a very good question and a timely one. I think at the highest level, there's three things. We're looking for impact. We're looking for competitive terms and commercial structures and pricing. And we're looking for confidence that if we're committing to a project being online by a certain date, that it's going to come online by that date. Because there are downstream effects for us, especially if we're relying on these projects for unlocking new data center growth and or to meet sustainability goals. I think when we double click into it for advanced technologies, right? When we think about clean firm, I think there is an important part of that, puzzle piece, if you will, for wind and solar plus storage. But I think for today, I'll probably focus primarily on more novel technologies, more 24/7 kind of generation profiles. And there are at least a few important areas that we would want to think about. First and foremost is the technology risk itself. This is obviously something Brad and Paul can speak to at greater length, but for someone like Microsoft, when we're having these conversations, really important to understand where are these companies, where are these technology providers in their own journey in the technology readiness level curve. We speak to many companies that are very early stage and maybe have not even deployed anything in the field yet, and maybe that's too early for us. But even as you get later, there's still a bit of a gap between some of those mid levels around 5 or 6 to actually being fully deployed and mature, if you will, from a technology perspective. And so that's where it requires us to get creative and think about, I think, David, you might have just been alluding to it, or Joby, how do we provide the requisite confidence to the counterparty, the seller, and the market more broadly that there's a firm commitment for an offtake agreement, but also protecting Microsoft's interests should the technology not, transpire in the way that we're all hoping it does. So I think there's a bit of a balancing act there. I think another important point would be around the timeline. So when we think about certain kinds of technologies, right, Paul and the team at FERVO are already generating clean megawatt hours to the grid today, and they have a lot more expansion coming in the forthcoming years. But some of these other technologies, maybe advanced geothermal is still 2030s beyond. I think when we talk about certain kinds of nuclear technologies, that's 5 to 10 plus years out. And so there's a really important question that we have to ask about what are our needs? How do they differ on a temporal basis? And how do we think about maybe signing an offtake for a contract today, even if we know that we're not going to get a benefit for it before that, North Star goal that I talked about with being carbon negative by 2030. So I think that's another important piece. Similarly is scaling capability. So very cognizant of the fact that when we're deploying some of these first of a kind solutions, maybe the initial project is pretty small. Maybe it's 10 megawatts, right? But we have ambitions to be expanding data centers across the globe with much higher amounts of megawatts than 10. And so when we think about how do we go from initial deployments of these novel solutions to full-on scaling, that's a really important piece for us to understand as well. That's where things like right of first offer as part of an offtake agreement could be compelling for someone like Microsoft to understand, okay, maybe we're signing a deal for this initial small project and it's a more targeted basis, but we really want to grow and scale with this solution provider as their technology is more proven. I would say that there's not necessarily a minimum size requirement for our offtake agreements. Generally speaking, historically, we've done agreements in the hundreds of megawatts on average, I'd say, just because we have such a significant gap to hit for all of our different goals and we have limited human resources on our side to do all these different offtake agreements. So we're trying to get some economies of scale. But generally speaking, I think it's more about understanding what is the right fit for a given solution and how do we think about the long timeline for scaling rather than saying there's hard and fast rule about it must be X megawatts for us to consider it. I think I'm just trying to think of other considerations. Geographically speaking, and Paul, you can probably speak to this better than I can. When we think about something like geothermal, at least today in the US, that's largely confined to WECC, the western half of the United States. But there's great ambition, not just within Paul's side of things, but hyperscaler side of things, that one day we can unlock geothermal everywhere. So as we continue making advancements in the underlying technology, deploying it at scale, and making the financing community more comfortable of underwriting these projects, that will only help us to continue expanding the geographical footprint. And then knowing other kinds of technologies like Brad is working on or nuclear are probably a little less constrained from a pure geographic perspective.
And maybe Mike, to double click on geography, like how do you think about onboarding some potential providers where they can provide their power to where your data centers are, and how that perhaps is a gating item?
Yeah, I think this is a question that comes up very often, and it's probably the most complicated one to answer both now and when I'm talking to counterparties individually, because a lot of times, even myself being one step removed from understanding, when does the business commit to a new data center and where that's going to be and what the timeline is for that power to come on. We need to understand what is the right fit in terms of geographical boundaries that we can bring a project online within in terms of proximity to that data center, and is the timing going to be right? So oftentimes we might be catching wind on my side, if you will, that a new data center is going to get built and we have maybe 2 to 3 years before it starts ramping up. And that would be a really hard conversation for someone that's first looking to deploy a greenfield solution and hasn't made any development progress to date. So I think part of it is when we think about having these kinds of conversations, it's helpful for me to understand, well, where is your project pipeline? Even if I don't have an exact fit for you right now, things move very quickly here. And so I might have a very different answer tomorrow and say, oh, you have a project in this location coming online in 2028. We should probably discuss that further because it could be a good fit for us. So I'd say early communication, often communication is good, so that way we understand where you're active. And then in terms of trying to provide a signal to the market about where we might need new resources. There's public information about where we have data center locations already. Generally speaking, that could be a decent indicator of where we might have additional load growth down the road. But otherwise, it's a matter of just having a good relationship so that way, if and when we get the new signal, we can go to the marketplace, understand where there might be projects that are a good fit for us.
And I just want to highlight that one point that you're willing to talk with early technologies who've yet to have deployment to build that relationship. So you can potentially, pave a way or a path to the future where you guys can collaborate or work together.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, part of it is, some technologies might be able to move through that technology readiness level cycle faster than others too. So you might be very early stage, but from a timeline perspective, it might not actually be all that problematic in terms of the needs that we're trying to solve. So we definitely have conversations with all kinds of technology providers and developers. And then maybe just to double click into your original question, David, when we think about actually unlocking data center growth, we get questions about this a lot too. Does it need to be behind the meter? Can it be front of the meter? Are you open to both? From a interconnection perspective, I would say in general, I tend to focus more on front of the meter deployments. So things that I would call around the meter, right? And close enough geographic proximity that if we're looking to unlock that data center growth with the capacity value of that resource, it's at least close enough to that data center location that it provides the host utility with the kind of resource adequacy benefits that it's looking for. We have an entire team here full of energy technologists who are looking at behind the meter solutions as well and thinking about other kinds of use cases. Be things like voltage ride-through, it could be waste heat recovery in use at a data center. So there's a massive spectrum of use cases that we're evaluating. I happen to focus most on resource adequacy and sustainability benefits, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way that Microsoft is thinking about energy.
Oh, it's wonderful. I'd love to kind of double click on these two next items. Like, can you talk a little bit about like delivery confidence? I feel that is like a great way to have startups understand what they need to bring to you as they're trying to build that relationship.
Yep, that's a good question. I would say that one of the more challenging dynamics that we're facing in this space is there's a segment of technology providers who, at their core DNA, is technology, right? They are building out the next advanced solution that can meaningfully advance clean firm power for the grid, but maybe they don't have a developer DNA strain as well, right? They know enough to get the projects going from a development perspective, but it's a very different game and probably harder today than ever before in our history to get a new project online and reaching COD. So one of the things that we're trying to constantly think about is how do we understand the potential pathways to getting an offtake done? And it doesn't always have to be that the technology provider itself needs to be the ultimate counterparty with Microsoft. We could bring in another third-party developer who's very seasoned at getting these kinds of projects online and operational. And ultimately, we're signing, the PPA with them, but they're ultimately delivering the technology solution that we're very interested in. And so I think there's a potential that we see more of these kinds of three-legged stool arrangements in terms of bringing the technology provider, a seasoned developer, and an off-taker to the table together.
Sounds great. And then, Microsoft has obviously significant resources. Can you talk about some other ways that startups can work with you beyond PPAs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I alluded to, the other team that's already looking at different technology solutions for more of a behind the meter application. We also, just given the size of this company, are fortunate enough to have our own climate innovation fund. So an in-house climate focused venture capital arm. And so they're a team that we focus on collaborating with pretty closely because their whole mandate is how can they leverage their resources, their financial resources, to help increase the likelihood of an investment leading to an offtake opportunity for my team or other relevant teams. So we have constant conversations with them to understand, to your point, David, what are the different kinds of advanced solutions, be it at any stage of maturation that we're interested in? And is there a potential that the Climate Innovation Fund can play a catalytic role in terms of advancing those solutions? So that could be from, and I won't try to be an expert on everything they do, but that could be, top co type equity investments. It could be project financing. It could be participation in other funds that are providing the capital needed to deploy and scale these solutions. So we're having regular conversations with them because ultimately we know that there might be some situations where we need that additional catalytic effect on the financing side in order to get the folks on my side to the point where we want to be in terms of signing an actual PPA.
Wow, that's great. Well, okay, now let's switch gears to the other side of the table, and we're going to now ask, Paul and Brad at ARBOR, who are in startups and growth companies, what's it like to negotiate against a hard-nosed businessman like yourself and their experiences in selling power to hyperscalers? So why don't we start off with Paul at FERVO, and then we'll move on to Brad.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And everything Mike just mentioned, I'll reiterate, because I've been with FERVO for the last 3 years, and where we were 3 years ago versus where we are today was a completely different landscape, different story. Power markets have evolved significantly. Data center demand has evolved significantly. But to Mike's point, it truly is an iterative process, especially with a new technology. These hyperscalers are extremely sophisticated when it comes to power markets. But and to be frank, they are, at least at FERVO, everyone, to meet this data center demand, everyone's exploring every potential solution out there, and we're noticing that. And our origination team is very hard at work speaking with the hyperscalers, the utilities of the world to make these projects work and to meet the demand. But it truly is an iterative process. And so to the extent that you can get in to Mike's point with these organizations earlier, and you can explain your technology, you can explain specific de-risking milestones, where you think the project will be at, how do you ultimately scale it, how much is it going to cost. I think what we've noticed at FERVO, and obviously we were fortunate back in 2021 to establish a longstanding partnership with Google as it related to our commercial pilot. That it was a 3.5 megawatt commercial pilot called Project Red. I encourage folks on this call to Google it, and you'll be able to to learn more about it. But I think that was Google's first entry point into supporting FERVO, and ever since then, it's been an extremely iterative, collaborative process. I think Mike mentioned this. These companies are massive, and they're truly devoting tons of resources, whether it be actual physical humans or other forms. But they're willing to take the time to understand this, and I think as early stage startups start having these conversations, I think it's prudent that you have to take it with a grain of salt and approach it from a lens of this is your at the startup, this is your day-to-day. You should know everything there is to know about this technology, and sometimes it's lost upon us that we're speaking to counterparts at other organizations, and you get frustrated and think, well, this is so obvious. Well, you also have to factor in that, as Mike alluded to, they're looking at, dozens of new technologies. And so, kind of words of wisdom or advice I could give to, people trying to break into the space with new technology is really to have a detailed, outline of how you plan, and depending on what stage you're in, how you plan on scaling the technology, because it is gigawatts, and it is as early as possible. If you talk to some of these counterparts, it's when do you need this power? 2 years ago would have been nice, right? So it's really trying to meet all these timelines, but being cognizant of what's realistic and what's not. And so the more and more, whether it's publishing white papers or just showing results of a commercial pilot, or how you plan to scale the technology, the easier these conversations become. And to be frank, again, when we first started, the conversations, 3 years ago are a lot different than what they are now, and a huge component of that is is testing, is meeting milestones, is coming up with a clearer picture. But it is fruitful, and it's not a waste of time to have and come up with a clear path on how you're going to scale and how you're going to meet these needs. Because again, as Mike alluded to, I think all these hyperscalers are willing to sign up for these deals, but they need clear visibility that you're going to meet the timelines, and you're going to be able to scale with them, right? And so it's a huge back and forth amongst the offtakers and the developers, and really making sure that once you've advanced from kind of your pilot stage project or whatever tech you're focusing on, you really bring in sharp folks who have a development background, who understand how complicated it is to develop these large infrastructure projects, and can really meet that timeline, and really show to these off-takers and hyperscalers that this company is serious, and is capable of achieving these goals. And I think we've been super pleasant with our partnership with Google. I think that's only going to continue, but our goal is to deploy as much 24/7 clean baseload power as we can. And so we're in discussions with utilities, numerous hyperscalers, and anyone who's looking for a product. And a huge part of that is and I think a lot of people might not like this answer, but it takes time, unfortunately, and you have to be methodical about how you approach it. You have to be methodical about how you convey everything. And the kind of wisdom that I could provide is to the extent that you can make things public and you can demonstrate results, that's going to be a huge value add in terms of advancing negotiations and conversations with a lot of these counterparties.
Wow, that is so valuable. Like the idea that your partnership with the hyperscale really is a partnership, and it kind of changes and grows over time, where you really have to do a lot of education, including public education. And it's no surprise that requires a lot of time and effort. No one's just going to hand you a PPA, a 20-year PPA. So let's now switch on to Brad, and see what's your experience right now. I know you guys are actively engaged with a number of hyperscalers.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think Paul just unloaded a ton of wisdom on the group, so I think I'll build off a number of his points as well. But I think just to kind of hit it on the head again, 24/7 carbon-free energy is actually really hard to get. It does require new technologies, and it takes a lot of creativity on both sides of the table to get these projects online. But a lot of people need to do the work and able to create that new kind of resource. It is not a given, and it takes just a ton of work by a ton of people over a long period of time. And I think Paul's points, iteration is the name of the game, and setting these core milestones on the roadmap to electrons helps increase transparency and provide structure to assessing how the project is going. I think that the hardest part up front is establishing credibility and trust. And as a startup, you don't have a lot of history. It's a new company, it's a new technology, and often some of the contracting structure is new territory as well. And so building rapport, educating them on our offering, and hearing out their needs in detail, which is what they're solving for, what matters most to them, regions of specific interest, and how we can figure out a project or a set of projects that is really going to get everyone excited. And I think in many ways, it's also demonstrating that we're going to be a good partner to work with for years and even decades, because PPAs are, getting a project financed. You're looking at 10, 20 years that you're going to be working with this party. So it's really being a group that can come to the table and problem solve together as we are ultimately trying to bring this resource online. We've found a huge way to build that credibility early is getting customers actually out to our real world test site, where they can see the pilot system in operation. They can ask questions with all of our engineering leads right there. And we'll spend a day out there in person, actually walking, climbing all over the test site, looking at pipes and valves, going to the control rooms. And it really kind of allows a customer to not only see the tech in person. I think it's so invaluable to see that this is actually real. It's not just fancy renderings, but it also gives the customer insight into our approach to developing technology and how we think very holistically about not only technology development, but product development and ultimately commercial deployment. And I think, as Mike brought up, it's the execution side, the actual development side is really where the rubber hits the road in deploying these new technologies. You can be great at developing new technologies, but if you can't actually bring it into the world and do so with a time frame that is relevant and that you can stick to, that is, in many cases, it's not the smartest person. It's the people that have a decade or multiple decades of experience actually executing projects. And so for us, it's maybe if it's people that we don't have directly on our team, it's a cabinet of advisors that are helping us. In some cases, we are embedding developers, folks that have deployed very similar technologies directly into our organization. Because ultimately, going from TRL 6 to fully commercial, it does take a lot of capital. And it is this feedback loop where the PPAs are essential to raising the capital to ultimately commercialize the technology. Raising more capital improves odds of success, can help resolve some of the issues and making sure you're hitting the timelines. It can help you scale up your production earlier and faster, because I think Mike mentioned that impact is one of the biggest lenses by which folks analyze or assess opportunities, and that's achieved when you start getting into the gigawatts. So how do you get to gigawatts as fast as possible? And that's where these partnerships can be really quite advantageous to unlocking that that resource adequacy, because we want to get to gigawatts of deployment as quickly as possible, and we see these partnerships as essential to doing that. So we think of it as gigascaling, whether it's gigawatts or gigatons of electrons and carbon. That's really however we can get there as fast as possible, and finding partners that can work with you along that journey. And of course, on the data center side, that infinite almost demand is really where we see a catalyst for developing and commercializing these technologies in a way that I think, to Paul's point, is even a few years ago, that landscape has shifted a lot. And so how can you use that demand as a pulling force and get everyone excited? But I can't stress enough how much I think it's doing that field trip, getting people out to seeing the hardware is I think really core in building that trust, that credibility, and showing that, hey, we're a team that's going to actually make this happen.
Amazing. I think when we close this variable section, Mike, do you have any kind of thoughts or anything you want to double click on what Brad and Paul said that kind of really resonate with you and your experience at Microsoft?
Yeah, to no surprise, it all resonates. I think let's see, I'll try to pick one thing for each. So Paul spoke to some of the frustrations that can come with different technology providers and working with the likes of a hyperscaler. And I would just say that that is certainly something I would admit to, right? When we're looking at all these different technologies, the discussion can get quite technical pretty quickly. And that's where I need to pretty quickly bring in some other people on my side as well, right? I tend to be more commercially minded. I'm not the deepest technology expert in the room. So I think part of it is understanding, and I think Paul mentioned this, the iterative process of you might start one day talking more commercially, and then you might have a next conversation that's more technical, and then you go back to the commercial and you're kind of bouncing around to figure out how do we get all the dots connected to make something actually happen. So I think patience on all sides is really critical in that regard. And then I think one point that Brad mentioned that stuck out to me is the one thing that's inevitable for a lot of these more burgeoning technologies is there will be a significant chunk of time where you don't have operational data from your projects. But one thing that can really help to ameliorate that or create some confidence on the off-taker side is, do we feel confident in the management team, right? We are having constant conversations, like Brad said, and you might be having those iterative discussions to figure out how do you ultimately get something done. And so short of actually being able to point to operational data, I know one thing that we'll discuss internally too is, well, do we just have the confidence that this team can deliver what they're talking about? And so making sure that there is open lines of communication constantly throughout the process, and that like we know our needs are not straightforward. And so making sure that the other side is really hearing and understanding what is it that we want. And maybe that is not the same cookie cutter solution that they tend to build and develop for other providers, but maybe it needs to be a little more bespoke for us. Having those kinds of conversations and just getting the confidence that short of the data points to prove the technology's credibility, we know that the human resources making it all happen are going to bring us that requisite level of confidence to ultimately go and sign a contract.
Great. People, people, people. Team, team, team. So now let's transition to our next part. Lisa, please take it away.
Great. So, we've heard a lot about milestones, and, this next question is pretty open-ended. We want to give folks the floor to chat about anything we've forgotten to mention, whether that's related to interconnection, to, having the right utility partnerships, to financing, to permitting. But I think it's clear that project development is a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And so if you have anything missing, the picture is incomplete. So I'm curious to hear folks' takes on, which pieces of the puzzle are especially important to be mindful of.
Yeah, I can jump in and kind of talk about the interconnection and transmission piece, because we haven't touched on that much. I think most people get excited when you get the PPA, but the PPA is not really bankable until the electrons are actually delivered. And so I think two of the most commonly underestimated milestones or gating items is interconnection and transmission. First, interconnection, it's not just paperwork, it's a multi-year engineering and queue process. And I oftentimes hear about people getting surprised by, you can have network upgrade costs, you see longer study timelines and even restudies sometimes. There can be changes in available capacity on the grid as the queue evolves. And then just the practical reality that the COD isn't controlled by construction, it's also controlled by the interconnection path. So then second, kind of aligned to that, is transmission, which I think is oftentimes a shadow constraint and oftentimes a binding constraint as well for clean firm scaling. Even if you have a fantastic, technically strong project, the system still needs to find a way to deliver into constrained load areas. And so the ability to move clean firm energy to where the load actually is requires transmission, and transmission isn't fast. It's a long lead time. A lot of parties can veto it. It takes a lot of coordination, permitting, cost allocation. And so the clean firm developers who win are the ones who win transmission.
I love that. Yeah, the ones who win transmission and interconnection. Cool.
So maybe the next session is, we're kind of running into our last 10 minutes of the webinar. we're doing something we call a lightning round, where we're going to have all the participants kind of give some closing advice for both clean power producers and clean power off-takers. We'll start with Mike, and then move to Paul, Brad, and then Joby.
All right. Maybe two pieces of advice. First would just be double clicking into what I mentioned earlier. Microsoft is a massive company, and it surprises me every day how many people are touching energy related topics within the company. I literally learn new people every day who are focused on energy. So with that comes, I think, to Paul's point again, like some frustration. You need to just be proactive in reaching out and trying to find who is the right person, who are the right groups within Microsoft that I actually need to be talking to. And I think there's a balance there between bombarding all parts of the organization with duplicative emails versus trying to find, a champion who can help you navigate internally. So just trying to find the right balance there would be one recommendation I have. I think the other is maybe just admitting that I and my team don't have all the answers, especially when it comes to creative commercial structures. So we have ways that we've done things in the past for contracting, and we have some thoughts about how we might need to morph that as we think about some more novel technologies. But you are the experts of your own solutions too. So we definitely welcome people to come to the table with not just information about the underlying solution that we're trying to contract for, but how do we think creatively about the commercial structure? Brad was talking about the missing money problem in those later stages of the TRL curve. So how do we think about closing that gap in a way that's mutually beneficial?
Paul, what about for yourself? What are some things you want to kind of share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just piggybacking off of what Mike said, and sorry, I should have caveated this with, I work in the finance group at FERVO, so this is just one key piece of the puzzle to ultimately getting these projects, financed and up and operational. But I think one of the major factors is really this evolution that I alluded to over the last 3 years that I've been with FERVO, but I mean certainly probably the last half decade. Everyone is coming at it from precedents, right, what they know, what they've seen before, and Mike kind of alluded to this, right? And so when you have a technology that's different than your, call it, vanilla wind and solar and battery, it's hard to get your counterparties to kind of pivot away from what they're used to, what they know. This is how it's always been done. And I think what's happening real time is a lot of these hyperscalers and a lot of these organizations are, again, devoting tons of resources to figuring it out and coming up with commercial or creative commercial strategies to help solve some of these issues, whether it's the funding gap, to help expedite and get some of these projects up and running. But I think this is all being figured out in real time, and I think there's a lot of smart people working on this, and it's going to be an interesting, call it, next 5 years, to see who thrives and who makes it. But I just, given the demand and the load growth, like we're going to have to figure this out. And so the more we can collaborate across corporations and work together to solve this issue, it's going to be especially domestically here, it's going to be a crucial part of the next 5 years, the next couple decades here in the United States. So I think it's imperative for us to all understand that yeah, we'd like this power as soon as possible, but is that realistic? And to the extent it's not, that what are ways we can achieve reasonable goals? And so kind of the last thing I wanted to hit on is I think it's interesting to see, especially from my perspective, how FERVO's grown over the years. I think I started and I was employee number 40, and I think we're a little over 200 to date. And so, we've grown significantly, and we have a massive development pipeline, and we're here to, again, deploy as many megawatts as we can onto the grid and get, and help solve the solution. So, I'm excited for what's to come at FERVO, but also excited to see, newer technology scale and what's to come in the next, call it decade or so.
Okay, Brad.
Awesome. Yeah, I think piggybacking on what everyone has said here, I think in terms of advice, we've really benefited from kind of the perspective or approach that we take, where 24/7 carbon-free energy is not a conventional sales process. It really is a partnership. And one of my kind of mentors talks about this go to discovery process rather than going to market, where you really are working hand in hand with the customer, with the partner, to figure out what are their needs, and very much crafting the solution that best serves their needs. And that does take this iteration. It also takes an ecosystem of partners. These projects do not get built on an island. They really take a network of partners that are ultimately going to increase your odds of success. And so finding the other partners, whether it's a development partner that can create that three-legged stool, like what Mike talked about, or depending on what kind of project you have, are there folks in that ecosystem that are ultimately going to lend credibility, lend diligence efforts that can provide third-party support for the customer, ultimately just trying to get to a yes and figuring out where is this at every corner, where can we make this a stronger partnership. We see hyperscalers have the ability to be a customer, a project finance partner, and an equity partner. And we think it's incredibly catalytic to align those incentives so that you are really working together on this outcome where everyone wins. But you have to do that legwork to show what will be most catalytic and or really paint a roadmap to what a successful partnership looks like. I think having all of that, before you get into term negotiation and all of that, really architecting what a successful partnership looks like on both sides, it's really kind of the critical pre-work that I think is an essential step to building a partnership that's really going to make you a category definer and get them gigawatts.
Great. And Joby, anything to do as
Yeah.
we close out this section?
Just quickly, I'd say don't forget the policymakers and the regulators. They can accelerate and decelerate, and there's many different levels from your city, your county, state, federal. It would be music to my ears if our regulator, like the CPUC, came to us and said, we want more clean, firm power. Like, educating and getting the regulators and the policymakers up to speed, I think can make a huge difference.
Okay, wonderful. Lisa, why don't you help us close this out and share some of what you think are the highlights of this 1 hour discussion?
Yeah, no, I'm excited to kind of look ahead to the next 5 years, as there's clearly surging demand for power, and the people around the table, around this virtual Zoom room, are really helping to craft that future. So I think, one thing that really stood out to me across everyone's comments was this need for partnership, for collaboration. And, as Brad put it very eloquently, it takes an ecosystem of partners, from development partners to the right utilities, and understanding what every person around the table or Zoom room really needs from the others. So I think, this conversation helps to lay some of that groundwork and the playbook ahead. Paul, it was really interesting to hear from you at FERVO on how your pioneering offtake from Google really happened because you were able to create those de-risked milestones and really hand in hand work through potential tech risks and policy and market risks. that lay ahead for geothermal. But it's clear that, that trust has been built, that partnership is in place. And so I think a lot of other project developers can look to that Google FERVO partnership as, as a great model. Mike, I appreciated your not so hot take on how to prioritize partners who can deliver projects on a meaningful timeline and to, provide that visibility again into how that power project is going to meet your data center demand in the next 2 to 3 years. And that might mean talking to partners who are earlier stage, but who know what they need to deliver to be that offtake partner for Microsoft. But yeah, those were some of the highlights that I heard. David would love to hear anything else that stood out to you or others from the group.
I think for me, just the one thing I'd close with, it's really all about the people in the room and it's about the team. So I think what Mike said is that this confidence in delivery is very key. And that means them building trust in the team, because a lot of these projects, a lot of these technologies will be first of a kind. There's not going to be a lot of data. You can't go to your nth of a kind project to say, like, this is how it works. And all this takes time. Like, I think what Brad said, that this is about building a partnership that will be decades long and gigawatts in size, is very important to think about. This is not a one-off, and this takes time. And then I think maybe Mike said a very important thing. A lot of these hyperscalers, utilities, industrial companies you're working with are gigantic behemoths. What you need to do is find your champion inside the firm that can be your Sherpa and help you navigate this process. But anyway, I just hope everyone really enjoyed this discussion as much as I did and Lisa did, and we're welcome to continue this conversation, hopefully in the real world, over drinks, coffee, or at the next DCarb Connect event in Houston.